Bright Tuty. Every student matters.
Hello students. So let's talk about our next chapter here, that is outcomes of democracy. Now throughout all the chapters that you have read in class 10th, we have discussed about the various components related to democracy. And in short, you have understood the whole concept of democracy. As in, what does democracy mean? So definitely, now you can answer this question. In simple terms, if you remember, as per Abraham Lincoln, how he defined democracy: to the people, for the people, and by the people. So here the common term that we can see is people. So definitely we know that in democracy, people, they are the source of power here, right? Source of power as in they have the rights to elect their representatives who are going to rule in the government. We have understood various aspects related to it, right? So in this chapter, we are going to analyze, or let's say assess, the outcomes of democracy. As in, what are the expectations from our democracy? Is it a positive outcome or is it a negative outcome? We are going to understand the whole concept of outcomes here through different parameters. Right, students? So first of all, let us talk about the assessment of the outcomes of democracy. Right? So we have understood the concept of democracy. You know that people, when we are talking about democracy, rule of the people is foremost because they have the whole and sole right to elect their representatives. But the power given to people. Now, in our democracy, we have to understand that the power that has been entitled to the common citizens of our country, is it good? Is it bad? Does it have any positive outcome? Does the government work according to the expectations of people, or they are not working according to the expectation of people? We are also going to evaluate the whole idea of democracy or the outcomes of democracy by comparing it with the other forms of governments. Let's say the autocratic government, monarchical form of government, and so on. Right? So the first point here is that assessment of the performance of any individual or institution, it depends on expectations. Right, students? Now, only when we have expectations towards anything, we are going to assess it on that parameter. Likewise, in our democracy also, we have a lot of expectations from our ruling government. Right? So, are they working in favor of the people? Are they working according to the opinions of people? Or are they working against the opinions of people? Right? So we are going to understand about this positive and negative outcome that I am trying to say here time and again. Right? Now people praise for the ideals and principles of democracy but criticize its actual working. Now whenever we are talking about any democratic country, here the best example can be taken of our own country. Right, students? So people belonging to different religions, different communities, they are living together. And they are voting for a particular party that becomes the ruling party. Right? So, when we are talking about the democracy in our country, we have to understand the positive and negative outcome here. And that can be assessed on the basis of expectations made. Now, the expectations can be very unreasonable. The expectations can be high. The expectations can be low, right? Depending on the nature of people. They can expect a lot from the ruling party, or they cannot expect anything from a ruling party. Now, that is how we are going to assess the whole outcome here. Correct? So, what happens in general terms or in general sense? We can say that people, they definitely praise for the ideals and principles of democracy. So the basic ideals and principles that have been entitled or given in our constitution definitely they are for speaking for the rights of the citizens. Now, these are some of the keywords that defines our democracy, the fundamental rights given in our constitution, right? The right to equality, right to justice, and so on. So here we see that people definitely they are praising for the ideals and principles that have been laid out in our democracy. And we have learned about these features regarding democracy in our previous chapters, right? So we see that, but they are definitely criticizing the actual working. Now, what the things that have been laid in our constitution, right, regarding the basic ideas of democracy and the actual working of our government, it is quite different, right, students? So we are going to analyze that as well. It is considered as the best alternative against monarchy or dictatorship or one-party rule. Now, despite all the differences here, despite the negative outcomes of democracy that are few, we see that it is considered as the best alternative. Definitely, students. Now, when we are talking about one-party rule, about monarchy government or the dictatorship, do you think it is better than democracy? No. Now, we have also read about it, right, students? So, in dictatorship, we see that no person, no citizen are offered a particular choice, right? So only one ruler is there, one monarch is there, one dictator is there, and he is ruling according to his own needs, according to his own wishes, and he is not giving any heed to the opinions of people there. So where is the ruling power of people there? It is not there. So in our democracy, we can say that there are many negative outcomes, but still it is considered as the best alternative against the other forms of government. Okay? But definitely we can also say that people are not satisfied with its working, with the working of the democratic government in some sense. Now, why are people not satisfied with the working of democratic government? Let us try to understand that as well. So, in this chapter, we are going to assess these outcomes that we are going to talk about here. Okay? So, here we also see that people prefer democracy for moral reasons and not prudential reasons. Now, students, you are seeing two terms here, that is moral and prudential. Now, when we are talking about democracy, people prefer democracy for different reasons. And one of them is the power sharing between government. Now, when we are talking about power sharing, you already have learnt about it in federalism as well. So, the power is being shared between the central and the state government, right? Apart from that, in many other countries, power is being shared between two different communities, right? So, when we are talking about power sharing, it can be given on two bases, that is moral reason and prudential reason. So, here we see that democracy is preferred for moral reason. Why? Because it upholds the spirit, the very spirit of democracy. But when we are talking about prudential reason, it shows or signifies that power sharing, it avoids conflict between different communities, right? So here we are seeing that more weightage is given to what? More weightage is given to moral reason rather than the prudential reason. The concept of avoiding conflict. Here we see that upholding the very spirit of democracy is the main issue, right? So people are preferring democracy for this reason. Now, democratic politics practiced in different countries have different socio-economic development and cultures. Another important point that you must keep in mind while we are talking about the assessment of the outcomes of democracy. So here what are we understanding? When we are talking about democratic politics, we all know that in many countries, democratic form of government has been adopted. Right? Now, when we are talking about democratic form of government, we see that there are some common features that are followed everywhere, be it holding elections at regular interval of time, giving rights to people, right? Equality of all, avoiding conflicts. So these are some of the common features of democracy followed everywhere. Nevertheless, what are we seeing here? We see that the democratic politics that are practiced in different countries, let's say the United States of America, right? Apart from that, many other countries that are following democracy as the form of government, they have different socio-economic development and cultures. Now, comparing United States and India, definitely the culture that we are following in our country is very much different from the culture of United States. That is the Western culture. Though we are inculcating the Western culture, but definitely the authentic culture that we have in our country, the ancient values, it differs a lot from the Western culture. Also the socio-economic development. We all know that in today's world, in today's era, the superpower here is United States of America. So the socio-economic development of India and the United States of America is very much different, right? The economic growth of United States of America is much more than our country when we compare it, right, students? So here you have to understand that all the countries that are following the democratic form of government, it is not there, or it is not for sure that they are going to have the same socio-economic growth, or they are going to have the same cultures, right? Now, when we are talking about the features or advantages of democracy here, what are some of the features that you have already learned? So, in brief, we are going to understand these features, okay? So, it promotes equality in society and enhances the dignity of individuals. Definitely, one of the basic points here that you have to understand is about equality and enhancing the dignity of individuals. In our country, whether a person is rich or poor, it doesn't matter. Everyone has the right to vote, right? The universal adult franchise that we follow in our country. Likewise, equality, as we all know that in our constitution, there are some basic fundamental rights that have been provided. Correct? So, one of them is right to equality. So, everyone is equal in front of law. The second point here is improves the quality of decision making. Yes, students. Now, we all know that whenever we are talking about the democratic government, it means that we are referring to the ruling party and all the other parties that are there in our government, right? The opposition party as well. So what are we seeing? When we talk about decision making or law making process, we see that many of these ministers who are the elected representatives, they are involved in the decision making process, right? So definitely a lot of negotiations, a lot of deliberations takes place in our country, and the outcome of that is that a better decision can be taken for our country, right, students? So it improves the quality of decision making. In fact, people are also involved here. How? So public opinions are always taken in mind there, right? While the people or the ministers, they are making the decisions. Provide scope and mechanism for resolution of social conflicts. Definitely. Now, we all know that democracy, it always talk about social harmony and respect of all individuals. So definitely resolving the social conflicts becomes one of the major point here. One of the advantages in democracy. Allows ample space for correction of mistakes. Yes. Now this is again one important point that we have learnt earlier. So whenever we are talking about ample space for correction of mistakes, it means that we all know that people are electing the government. Now, people are also judging the government as well. They are seeing that what are the decisions that are being taken by our ruling government. So if people they do not like the opinions or the ideas proposed by the ruling government, they definitely have a chance to voice their opinion, right? To criticize the government. Now, if the government is not working according to the will of people, they have a chance to elect another party. Here they have options, right? The opposition parties, they can be elected for the next time in next general election, right students? So here we see that ample time or ample space is given to the government as well to correct their mistakes and also to keep in check that the ruling party is working according to the will of common people. Also, people are led to believe that democracy is the panacea of all social, economic and political problems. Yes, people definitely believe that it is the cure. Panacea here it means cure. So, people are led to believe that democracy is the cure of all socio-economic and political problems. Now, when we are talking about socio-economic political problems, we are definitely referring to our society here, right? So, there are many issues that people face in our country. When we are talking about the social problems, definitely they have to resolve the conflicts among people or for the social upliftment of the minorities or the disadvantaged groups, right, who are not getting equal rights here. Economic, again, our country or the government is responsible for the economic upliftment of the people and of the country as well, right, providing employment to all the people. Then only employment can be, then only economy can be uplifted in our country. Apart from that, political problems. So here we see that democracy is seen as the cure for all these issues. We tend to criticize the democracy if it's not working properly. Definitely students. Now in our country, if you see news channels or if you are reading newspapers, you will see that media plays a big role in it, in forming public opinions apart from the opposition party by holding protests, demonstrations and so on. So what happens whenever people realize that the government is not working according to the will of people or they are not working for the welfare of people, they tend to criticize the working of the government, right? They tend to criticize democracy in this sense because they have elected their representatives with the thought that the government is now going to work for them, right? So, to keep in check the working of government, it is important to criticize the government as well. So, definitely we can say that people they tend to criticize democracy if it is not working properly. And definitely it is healthy for our democracy. Why? Because it does not lead to monarchy or the autocratic rule here. Let's say if the government is working according to their own wishes. Now, what is the difference here between the autocratic government and the government in democratic country? Right? So, these are some of the points that we have to keep in mind when we are talking about the outcomes of democracy. Hello students. Now, while we are talking about the outcomes of democracy, we have understood that the outcomes of democracy can be positive or negative. So, the best way to understand the outcomes of democracy is through assessment. Right? So, before this, we have understood about the assessment of the outcomes of democracy. Now, assessment can be done through expectations, and the expectations of people in our democratic country can be high, can be low, or can be reasonable or unreasonable. But we can say that only reasonable expectations can lead to reasonable assessment, right? So we also saw some reasonable points related to the positive outcomes of democracy, the features of democracy, such as promoting equality, avoiding conflicts, giving equal rights to people. But we also learned that if the democracy is not working well, people tend to criticize that democracy. And when we are referring to democracy here, we mean that we are talking about the government in power, right? Because you have already learned that in democracy, the elected representatives through the people, right? They are ruling the government, right? So these are some of the points that you have learnt earlier. Here we are going to talk about different parameters through which we can assess the outcomes of democracy. Now the first parameter that we are going to talk about is accountability, responsiveness and legitimacy of government. Now before starting this topic, students, I would like to point out one thing here. We are going to understand that this is the basic outcome of democracy. Okay? So here you have to understand few points. When we are talking about accountability, it means that the government has to be accountable to the people since they are being elected by the people. Responsive here, it means that they have to be responsible to the needs and demands of people, right? Third point here is legitimacy of government. We are going to understand if our government is legitimate by law or not, right? So one by one, we are going to understand these basic points here. But if someone asks you that what is the basic outcome of democracy, you can definitely reply here that the basic outcome is accountability, responsiveness and legitimacy of the government. Let us understand how is that possible here. So the basic premise of democracy is that sovereignty lies with the people. Now, if you have read the preamble in the Constitution, you must have heard the term that is sovereign. Apart from that, many other terms are there. Socialist, republic, right? So the term sovereign here, what does it mean? It means that people have the right to vote their elected representatives, right? So people are voting their elected representatives who in turn is taking the major decisions for them. Right, students? So the sovereign here is the elected representatives that has been elected by the people of our own country and who is ruling government there. Right? So therefore representatives should be accountable to the people. So here we can definitely say that since people are electing these representatives, so these representatives are now accountable to whom? Accountable to the common people who have elected them. They have to work according to the needs and demands of people, right? They should be able to participate in the decision-making process. Yes. So when we are talking about the democracy, the features of democracy, one of the good points of democracy is that people should be able to participate in the decision-making process, that is the very spirit of democracy here. Right? We also learn that whenever we are talking about decision-making process, so in our country, the decision-making process is quite long. Why? Because there are so many deliberations, negotiations among the people in the ruling government. So the decision-making process, it takes time. But does that mean that democracy is not good for our country? No. Because the outcome of this decision-making can be good for the people, can be beneficial to the people. Okay? So that was the positive point here. The advantages of the democracy, the democratic government that is elected by the people. Now let us talk about some of the disadvantages here, right? So that we can assess the outcome of this particular point here. Now democracy is assumed to be less efficient than dictatorships or monarchies. Now sometimes what happens? People, they tend to assume that democracy is less efficient. Now in the beginning of this chapter only, I told you that we are going to compare it with the other forms of government here, right? So we are comparing democracy with dictatorships or monarchies. Dictatorship, it means that rule of one person. He has the sole right in that government, right? And people, they do not have enough choice. So we see that efficiency of monarchies or dictatorship is much more than the democracy. Now how is that possible? Whole procedure of deliberations and decision making, it takes a lot of time. Now have I told you this right now or not? Yes, we discussed this right now. That the decision making process, let's say taking an example of any law. Whenever we are talking about decision making, it means that we are talking about the laws being passed in our country. We are talking about the major decisions related to any topic that has been brought out by the people of our own country, right? So the laws, we know that it has certain procedures to follow, right, students? And these procedures can take time. So the discussions take place when we are talking about at national level in Lok Sabha, then it passes on to the Raj Sabha, then it goes to the president, right? So deliberation is taking a lot of time here. Definitely decision making process is here taking a lot of time. So we can see that the whole procedure of deliberation and decision making, it takes a lot of time. So people, they tend to believe that democracy is not that efficient in this sense. Now legal procedures have to be followed in detail. All the legal procedures, whenever we are talking about any laws, any major decisions taken by the government, it is going to take time. So people, they become impatient related to that, right? And they tend to criticize the democracy. But again, we should talk about the non-democratic government. We said that the non-democratic government, they are much more efficient than the democratic government. So let us try to analyze that point as well. So quick decisions taken by non-democratic countries may not be acceptable to the people and therefore may face problems. Yes, definitely this can be a point here. Now the non-democratic governments, here talking about the monarchies or dictatorship. Okay. So what happens in this form of government? There is only one ruler, right? One leader. And this leader has to take all the decisions. There might be many other ministers around him who is going to suggest him a lot of different options. But the main decision taking power here is the leader, the dictator, right? So the decision can be taken in a quick manner, right? But these quick decisions, are they good for the people or are they bad for the people? It cannot be said, right? So these quick decisions, they may not be acceptable to the people. So what can we say about this non-democratic form of government here? We can say that the decisions taken by the non-democratic form of government can be good for people or cannot be good for people. But the quick decisions cannot be acceptable for the people, by the people, right? So here we can say that in long term, in non-democratic government, the people, they are going to face problem along with the government, right? In democracy, what happens? Decisions taken through deliberations might prove efficient and effective. Yes, now this is justifying our democratic form of government. Why? Because decisions here, we know that it is going to take a lot of time. But the decisions that have been taken can be fruitful for the people living in our country. Right? So definitely it is taking time, but it is efficient and effective. In a democracy, deliberations and negotiations, they follow certain norms and procedures. Yes, so there are certain norms and procedures, certain rules and regulations in simple terms that have to be followed in order to pass, right? Any law, any decision that we are talking about here. So a citizen has the right and means to examine the process of decision making. This is known as transparency. Now here you are seeing a new term and very important term in context of democratic government. Yes, students. So when we are talking about transparency, it means that people in a democratic country have the rights and means to examine if the decision making process has been taken place through correct procedures, correct rules and regulations. So this process is known as transparency. And whenever we are talking about transparency, we will see that in the non-democratic countries, the whole idea of transparency is not available there. It is not present there. So definitely, democratic form of government is much better than the non-democratic form of government here. Okay? In a democracy, interests and welfare of the people are supreme. Yes, rule of the people in democracy, it justifies this point here. We have already talked about democracy for the people, of the people, by the people. Right? So people have the supreme power here to elect their representatives, and also they can criticize the government if the government is not working for the welfare of people, to keep them in check. Right, students? So we can say that in democracy, the interests and welfare of people is supreme here. Okay? A democratic government should develop mechanisms for citizens to hold it accountable and participate in decision-making process. Nevertheless, we can definitely improve the quality of our democracy. Right? And how can it be done? By making the government more accountable, and it can be done through the participation of people in decision-making process. Right? Through discussions, right? Through deliberations that we are talking about in an efficient and effective manner. Right? So here you have to keep in mind these important points. Now here let us understand the next point, that is how successful is democracy. We have understood one parameter here, that accountability, responsiveness and legitimacy that we are going to talk about later on. But accountability and responsiveness we have understood. Accountability in what sense? That people, they are choosing their representatives, and these representatives should be accountable to the people, right? Responsive in a sense that the government should be responsible to the needs and welfare of the people. So these 2 points you have to keep in mind here. The third point, legitimacy, we are going to discuss that as well. So when we are talking about how successful is democracy, let us talk about these features here. So holding regular elections. Taking the example of our own country, students, that is India, we know that the general elections in our country takes place after every 5 years, right? 5 years. Okay? But we do see that electoral malpractices are prevalent in our country. Yes. Now, whenever we are talking about elections, Whenever you're watching news, students, and during the time of elections, you will see that the Election Commission of India, who has the power to hold these regular elections, they always go on and set down the moral code of conduct for all the participants or the candidates and political parties. So why this is done? To avoid the electoral malpractices. In our country, there are many data that shows that these political parties, they invest a lot in electoral campaigns. They are giving monies to these poor people who are in need, and in return they are asking for their votes. Now this is how they are getting votes. So there are some many malpractices that are practiced in our country. Nowadays, the Election Commission of India is quite strict about it, so definitely it has reduced. But we can say that elections are taking place, but side by side, electoral malpractices are also prevalent in our country. Open public debates take place in a democracy. Yes. Now, whenever we are talking about open public debates, we are talking about the opposition political parties as well. The main idea or the main aim of opposition parties in our democratic government is to criticize the ruling party, forming or shaping public opinion. Now, how are they shaping public opinion, students? This is done through open public debates. Now, whenever any common citizen, any person, any individual that we are talking about, whenever he or she watches the television and he or she is seeing any public debate related to any law passed by the ruling government, so they are going to shape an opinion about that government, right? So people are getting aware about it now and then, and therefore it is shaping opinions of the people. And this is only done through the open public debates, that is good for a democracy. Shaping public opinion. Reasonable to expect a democratic regime to be attentive to the needs and demands of people. Definitely. We have talked about it right now, that whenever we are talking about a democratic government, it has to be responsible. Right? So this point is again important for you. Responsible towards the or attentive towards the needs of people. Expected that a democratic regime is free of corruption. Another major point here. Now again I would go back to the point that while watching news or reading newspapers, we know that one of the issues that our government face all the time is corruption. That is again prevalent in our country. Right, students? So the corruption can take many forms, and now and then it is being debated in media or in newspapers, and people are giving out their opinions that how corruption is being practiced by the ruling government, let's say, or any other political parties. Right? You would also see that whenever we talk about election campaigns, one of the main issues that these political parties they are pointing out is related to corruption, that they would make India free of corruption. So again, this is a major issue in our country that people are also facing, right? It is somewhat impacting the common people only, right, students? So here it is expected that a democratic regime should be free of corruption. Less sensitive to the needs and demands of people. That is a common problem in non-democratic country. Now comparing the democratic form of government with the non-democratic form of government here, we see that in our government, definitely the political parties, the government here is responsive to the needs of people. But when we are talking about non-democratic government, we see that they are less sensitive to the needs and demands of people. Why? Because they do not care about the wishes of people. They are going to work according to their own will, according to their own wishes. Because there is no democracy there, there is no rule of people there. Right? So comparing this point, we can say that democracy is somewhat successful or somewhat good than the non-democratic government. Democratic government is essentially a legitimate government. Now here you have to understand this point. What is this legitimate government, or what does this legitimacy mean here? So it is backed by people's sanction to rule. Yes. So lawfully we see that it is an acceptable government. Why, students? Because it is people have given sanction to rule to these elected representatives. Now people through elections are voting, right? So lawfully they are going to elect a government that is going to rule on the behalf of people. You have to understand this point like this here. Okay? So they are ruling on the behalf of people, and people have given sanction, have given the right or authority to these elected representatives to rule, right? Majority of countrymen, they elect a democratic government during an election. This is the whole point that you have to understand here. A democratic government is elected by the people, unlike an authoritarian regime. Yes. Comparing again with the authoritarian regime, we see that the despotic rule here, for example, in history you have read about many authoritarian rules, right? You have read about the French Revolution, you have read about the Russian Revolution. So during those periods, what happened? There was a monarch, a king who was ruling the whole government there, right? So here, unlike the authoritarian regime that is ruled by one person, we see that in democratic government, elections take place and the ruler, not the ruler but the minister or the political parties that come to the power, they are through the votes of the common people. And that is how we say that the democratic government is a legitimate government. Here we also see that in countries like Bhutan and Myanmar, they have worked towards becoming a democracy. So if we talk about Bhutan, students, we have constitutional monarchy there. So before that there was authoritarian regime, the monarch there. Now we have constitutional monarchy, that the monarch has the power but it has to work under the constitution, right? We have also seen this part when we are talking about the historical events. In the French Revolution as well, you have heard this term of constitutional monarchy, right? And when we are talking about Myanmar, we see that civilian government was installed here, not restored, installed. But before this, when we are referring to Myanmar, we see that there was the dictatorship, authoritarian regime in Myanmar. So these two countries are also struggling to have or to become a democratic country. Here the best example can be taken of Nepal. That people's quest for democracy, it led to the overthrow of monarchy in Nepal. Definitely. So when we are talking about Nepal, students, earlier what was there? Which form of government? Monarchy. Right? The authoritarian regime. But here we see that people, they fought for or demanded for a new constitution, right? And finally, the monarchy was overthrew there. There was no longer the king who was the ruler there. Now, a civilian government has been installed in Nepal as well. So we are seeing that people, they are going or they are working in favor of a democratic form of government. Definitely, we have learned that there are many negative outcomes here. But these negative outcomes are few as compared to the positive outcomes of democracy. Okay? So you have to keep this point in mind here. So the first question that we have is, which regime usually develops a procedure to conduct social competition and reduce the possibility of social tension? So the options here are democratic regime, dictatorial regime, non-democratic regime, and none of these. So in this question, let us see what are the keywords here. So we are talking about the type of regime that usually develops a procedure to conduct social competition and reduce the possibility of social tension. Looking at the options here, we have dictatorial and non-democratic regime, right? So when we are talking about dictatorial and non-democratic regime, what are we seeing here? Do we see that there is reduction or any possibility of avoidance of social tension? No, we haven't read that till now. In fact, we have seen that in democratic or in dictatorial or non-democratic regime, the ruler, they rule according to their own will. This is the keyword here, right? And not according to the will of people. But it is only in the democratic regime that we see that the government tries to avoid possibility of social conflict and procedure to conduct social competition, right? So the correct answer here is democratic regime. The next question is, which factor is often missing from a non-democratic government? Just mark the keyword here, students. We are talking about the non-democratic government. The options are efficiency, effectiveness, transparency, and none of these. Now, sometimes the non-democratic government, they can be effective, right, in some decisions that might be worthful for the people. But talking about option C here, that is transparency. Now, we have read about transparency in this topic, right? So, transparency was a means, the rights and means that a citizen has to make sure that the decision making process was done through correct procedure, right? So the idea of transparency is not available in non-democratic government, right? It is only available in the democratic form of government. Let's say the best example can be Right to Information Act, right? So if any person, he wants to know the procedure, the way the decision has been taken related to any particular issue or topic, right? It can be related to his mark sheet as well, right? So if you want to know how you have been given marks in your paper, you want to know the exact marks, right? So you can definitely go and ask for it. This is the transparent government and it is only available in the democratic form of government, right? So there is a certain rules and regulations, procedures that you have to go through in order to get the output or the result that you want, right? Now, which type of government is based on the idea of deliberation and negotiation? Quite simple question here. Let's see the options. Monarchy, democracy, dictatorship and oligarchy. So, definitely answer here should be B, that is democracy. All the other forms of government, monarchy, dictatorship, oligarchy, it is not based on the idea of deliberation and negotiation. And that is why in democracy, the decision-making process takes time, right? So, this is the correct answer. Now, what should be the most basic outcome of democracy? What are you going to write in this answer, in this question, students? Now, if you remember, in the beginning itself, I told you that accountable, responsive and legitimate government. Now, this is the basic outcome of democracy. Now, why are we saying that, students? Because we know that in our democracy, we choose our representatives. Now, these representatives, they are accountable to the people. They have to work according to the will of the people, right? According to their will, according to their opinions, according to what they want. And also they are legitimate, Because the sovereignty lies in the hands of people who elect their representatives who are taking the final decisions, right? So this is how you have to answer this question. You have to write the most basic outcome of democracy is accountability, responsiveness and legitimacy of government. Okay? Now the next question is, what is transparency? Now how are you going to answer this question? Just now we read about it, right? Transparency in the other question as well. So it is the right and means through which a citizen can get to know about the right procedure followed, get to know if the right procedure was followed in the decision making process. This is the whole idea of transparency, and it is not available in the non-democratic government. So this is how you have to answer this question. Now the next question here is, how does democracy produce an accountable, responsive and legitimate government? Now here students, you have read a lot of points. Now you have to accumulate all those points and answer this question here. So how are you going to talk about, or what are you going to talk about in this question? The first point that you can mention is that this is the basic outcome of democracy. Why and how a democracy produces an accountable government? So it is the government of the people, where people choose their representatives through elections who are accountable and responsive to the needs and opinions that I have been repeating again and again of people, right? Now here you have to see how accountable. So the decision making process takes place through deliberations and negotiations, that is beneficial. Just mark the keywords here students. Beneficial for the people. Now decisions have to be taken keeping in mind the needs and demands of the people. That is how the government can be responsible towards the people, right? Also legitimate, how? So the sovereignty lies in the hands of people. They elect their representatives through the process of elections, and these representatives in turn take the major decisions of the government, and that has to be done keeping in mind the participation of people in the decision making process. Okay, so here you have to answer this question, and you can also compare it with the non-democratic form of governments and how they are not so beneficial or not so good than the democratic form of government, right? One example that you can give is that whenever we are talking about non-democratic government, quick decisions, the decisions that we see as efficient might not prove efficient towards the people in non-democratic government. Why? Because in non-democratic government, if the dictator or the monarch is taking the decisions in haste, it might not be fruitful for the people of that place, or they might not be happy with the decisions taken. But when the decisions that are taken through deliberation and negotiations, they might prove fruitful for the people, right? So this is how you can here compare the whole idea that we have done in this topic here. Okay. Hello students. So let's talk about our next parameter here, that is economic growth and development. Now students, before this we talked about the basic outcome of democracy that we understand as being accountable, responsive and legitimate, right? We talked about all 3 pointers here. We tried to compare it with the non-democratic regimes and saw how despite all the few negative outcomes, let's say not all but few negative outcomes, democratic form of government is still far better than any other form of government, and it is still considered as the best form of government, right, across all the places, right, all over the world.